Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly through the heavy wooden gates of a medieval monastery, the kind that creaks like your neighbor's garage door at 2 in the morning. The air is thick with the smell of wet stone, beeswax candles, and, oddly enough, fermenting grain. You're about to learn that monks didn't just pray and copy manuscripts, they brewed beer with the same devotion. And honestly, without it, life back then would have been about as refreshing as drinking straight from a muddy ditch. You probably wouldn't have survived 2 days, unless you had a stomach made of cast iron and a taste for parasites. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below. Tell me what time it is where you are, and maybe what the weather's like outside your window right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You drift deeper into the cloister, your sandals echoing against flagstones worn smooth by centuries of slow-moving feet. Everything feels hushed, almost as though the very walls are soaked with prayer. Yet in the corner there's a different kind of devotion, large vats filled with bubbling mixtures of barley, oats, and sometimes wheat. This is where brewing was born into a sacred rhythm, the monks crafting their beer not as a luxury but as a necessity. Imagine it. No clean tap water, no chilled soda, just beer, mild, nourishing, and safer than anything drawn from the village well. It's easy to romanticize, but the truth is far more practical. In those drafty stone halls, beer was their liquid bread. You can picture a line of brothers, hoods pulled low, sipping from wooden cups as though they were just part of the daily office. Matins, lords, prime, and pint. Each mug carried calories and hydration, and in some monasteries, beer was rationed daily, measured as carefully as their prayers. Not because anyone feared excess, but because beer really was food, a controlled portion of survival. Of course, monks weren't the first to figure out fermentation. Ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians had been letting grains bubble into something frothy long before the first cloister was laid. But what's fascinating here is how seamlessly beer slid into religious life. Monks saw brewing as labor in service of God, an extension of ora et labora, pray and work. Brewing, after all, took patience, cleanliness, and discipline. In some ways, their vats were as holy as their altars. And let's be real, if you had to chant psalms for hours in a chilly chapel, wouldn't you want something warm and filling waiting for you afterward? The irony is delicious. The church, an institution often preaching restraint, became a hub of brewing innovation. And yet, beer was never framed as indulgence. It was survival, and it was charity. Pilgrims traveling long roads often received a mug for free at the monastery gates. One sip might have kept them from collapsing in the mud. Think of it as medieval. Roadside assistance, minus the tow truck plus some yeast. But don't let the calm picture fool you. Brewing inside a monastery wasn't as serene as it sounds. Fires crackled, kettles hissed, and the air smelled like a strange mix of porridge and wet hay. You'd probably wrinkle your nose at the first whiff, then slowly realize that this sour-sweet perfume meant safety. In a way, the monastery brewery was the heartbeat of the cloister, humming quietly alongside the steady rhythm of prayer. The oddest part? Most of those monks had no idea why fermentation even worked. They just trusted it. To them, yeast was invisible magic, not a microorganism. Beer seemed almost miraculous. Grain and water left alone suddenly transformed. A gift from God, they would say. And who could argue? If your choices were dysentery or a frothy mug of liquid bread, you too might call it divine intervention. Historians still debate whether monks brewed primarily for survival or whether they also leaned on it for morale. After all, a little buzz takes the edge off a fasting day. And speaking of fasting, that's where the story takes its quirky turn. Because monks weren't technically allowed solid meals during certain fasts, but beer was liquid, so it didn't count. That loophole kept them nourished through long seasons of abstinence. Imagine explaining to a strict abbot that your mug of hearty ale was basically like drinking soup. Somehow the argument stuck. Today we argue about what counts as a meal replacement shake. Back then they had holy beer. Step outside the cloister walls for a moment in your imagination. The village down below survives on thin porridge and questionable well water. The monks, meanwhile, sip steady cups of ale, healthier and sturdier because of it. It's no wonder monasteries grew into brewing powerhouses. They had the time, the resources, and the discipline to perfect it, and the people around them noticed. Soon the monastery wasn't just a place of prayer, but a place of dependable beer. Think about that. A world where faith and fermentation coexisted so naturally that no one blinked. In fact, the idea of separating them would have seemed ridiculous. Brewing wasn't a hobby. It was part of the sacred order. Like tending the gardens or illuminating manuscripts, beer was just one more way to live in harmony with God's creation. As the night grows deeper around you, you can almost hear the soft hiss of a fermenting vat and the chant of monks echoing through stone corridors. One rhythm overlaps another, the bubbling of yeast, the cadence of prayer. You sense the beginning of a long, complex journey, one where every sip of beer carried not just sustenance, but centuries of devotion. And so your walk through the cloisters continues, the scent of grain and candle wax clinging to your robe, while somewhere in the dark a brother stirs a wooden paddle through steaming mash, never suspecting he's helping shape the history of beer itself. You keep moving deeper into the cloister, the stone walls sweating with damp, the air holding onto that faint sour tang of fermentation. Tonight you realize why beer was more than ritual. It was survival. You see, water in medieval Europe was a gamble. Picture dipping your bucket into a nearby stream. It might look clear, but lurking inside were enough bacteria to turn your stomach into a battlefield. People drank it when they had no choice, of course, but the wiser choice, the safer one, was ale. And not just for monks. Whole communities leaned on this simple, low-strength brew to keep themselves upright. It's almost comical to think that beer back then was a public health strategy. Imagine your doctor today prescribing 3 pints a day keep the dysentery away. Yet that was basically the logic. By boiling the mash, they unknowingly killed pathogens, and fermentation introduced alcohol that kept the drink safe a little longer. To them, this was not science. It was just what worked. They didn't have germ theory, but they had survival instincts sharper than a tax collector's quill. The monks leaned into this truth. Their cloister wasn't just a refuge for the spirit, but a safe drink factory. The irony? In chasing purity of the soul, they also engineered purity of the stomach. Monks and villagers alike understood that a mug of small beer, a weak brew with low alcohol, wasn't just enjoyable, it was protection. Children drank it, workers drank it, monks drank it. Everyone was in a sense gently buzzed their entire lives. And that's not me exaggerating, it was simply woven into daily routine. You'd have your prayers, your bread and your ale, just as naturally as we'd grab coffee and scroll aimlessly on our phones today. Still, it wasn't glamorous. Don't imagine shiny copper kettles or neatly bottled lagers. These were rough wooden vats, sticky floors, and constant experiments. Sometimes the brew came out thin, other times sharp with herbs, and occasionally, well, let's just say there were surprises. If you ever complained about your morning coffee tasting burnt, imagine your breakfast drink tasting faintly of moss and dirt. At least Starbucks gives you a loyalty card, but the safety factor remained undeniable. Beer was literally life insurance in liquid form. And while nobles might have dabbled in wine, common folk leaned on ale because grapes were scarce in northern Europe. Grain, on the other hand, was everywhere, and it worked beautifully when boiled and left to bubble. In a way, beer became democracy in a mug. Everybody had it, from the smallest child to the sternest abbot. One curious twist here is how beer shaped schedules. In some monasteries, specific times were marked not just by bells but by beer. After long stretches of chanting and work, a small ration was poured, measured out by stewards who treated mugs as carefully as relics. If a brother tried sneaking an extra sip, you can imagine the gossip spiraling around the cloister, faster than today's office rumors about who stole the last donut. The drink wasn't about indulgence, it was about survival and structure. Historians still debate just how dependent medieval people were on ale versus other liquids like weak cider or milk. Some argue that the scale of reliance has been exaggerated. Others insist it was central to everyday life, especially in monasteries where rules kept brewing consistent. The truth probably lies in between, but the point remains. Beer wasn't a luxury, it was the backbone of hydration. And don't forget the pilgrims. Travelers who knocked on monastery doors weren't just looking for shelter. They were looking for something safe to drink. A sip of ale could be the difference between reaching Canterbury or collapsing in a muddy ditch outside town. The monks knew this, and part of their charity was sharing ale with weary strangers. One monk ladling out mugs might have saved more lives than he ever realized. It's funny to imagine how normalized all of this became. No one questioned whether it was odd for children to drink beer. No one panicked about productivity slipping, because workers had a pint with breakfast. It was simply how things were done. The only real complaints came when the brew was bad. And bad beer could make a monk's reputation plummet faster than forgetting an important psalm verse mid-chant. You take another step in your imagined cloister, and you can hear it. The clink of wooden mugs against stone tables. The satisfied sigh of monks and pilgrims alike, grateful for a drink that didn't try to kill them. Beer was their daily miracle, as unglamorous as it was essential. In the dim candlelight, the vats stand like silent guardians, bubbling away with the secret to survival. And as the night presses closer, you can't help but marvel at the simple truth. In a world where water betrayed them, beer was faith you could swallow. Your steps echo again, and this time you find yourself drawn toward the refectory, the dining hall, where long wooden tables gleam under candlelight. This is where the phrase liquid bread comes alive. You sit at the bench, a rough mug placed in your hand, and you realize this beer isn't just a drink, it's a meal. Thick, cloudy, heavy with grain, it slides down like porridge disguised as a beverage. Each swallow carries calories, proteins, and comfort. It doesn't sparkle like the lagers you know today. It feels closer to sipping on a loaf of bread that someone had the audacity to liquefy. The monks knew exactly what they were doing. Bread and beer were siblings, both born of grain and yeast. One was chewed, the other swallowed, but each sustained life. And in those draughty stone monasteries, sustenance was everything. You could survive without meat. You could even stretch without vegetables. But without your daily ration of grain in bread or beer, you'd crumble like old parchment, left too close to a candle. For the brothers, this ration was carefully calculated. A monk might receive a set number of mugs per day, each one tied to the rhythm of the hours. Matins, lauds, prime, and pint. The ritual wasn't loud or joyful. It was quiet, almost reverent. You didn't guzzle. You sipped steadily, letting the heaviness warm you through long stretches of prayer and fasting. And when Lent arrived, when rules forbade solid meals, this liquid bread was the loophole that kept bodies alive. No chewing allowed became, keep drinking steadily, and yes, before you laugh, they really did lean on beer as fasting fuel. Imagine someone today trying to argue that their protein shake is technically not food, and therefore allowed on a cleanse. Same logic, different drink. Historians still debate just how strict the fasts were, and whether monks stretched the definition a little too far. But the evidence is clear. Beer kept them standing through seasons when the table was stripped bare. This wasn't just a monk thing either. Villagers saw beer as a staple meal too. Children drank it, workers relied on it, women brewed it at home in smaller batches. Small beer, as it was called, might be weaker, but it carried the same principle. A drinkable loaf of bread. You can almost see a laborer in the fields, wiping sweat from his brow, taking a gulp of thick ale and feeling full enough to keep swinging his scythe. No sandwiches needed, just grain you didn't have to chew. And here's the twist you probably didn't expect. In some monasteries, beer wasn't just rationed, it was tiered. Stronger beer for feast days, weaker beer for ordinary days, and sometimes an extra weak batch just for children and the sick. It was a sliding scale of liquid bread, carefully aligned with the calendar. Forget today's endless debates about carbs. Back then, nobody was on keto. Everyone was on beero. The experience of drinking it was surprisingly tactile. Warmth spread from your chest outward, a sense of being full but not stuffed. It was heavy, yes, but not cloying. The monks must have cherished that comfort, especially in winter when the stone walls froze and meals were sparse. You sip and imagine the quiet gratitude in that hall, not laughter, not chatter, just the soft hum of satisfaction. Still, not all beer was created equal. Some batches failed, and you'd end up with a sour sludge closer to vinegar. Some came out watery, leaving you hungry. And then there were the miracle batches, where everything aligned, the grain quality, the yeast, the timing, and suddenly you had something almost delightful. Of course, delightful by medieval standards might mean doesn't taste like damp hay. But hey, in their world, that was worth celebrating. One thing that fascinates historians is how much of this was deliberate craft versus happy accident. Did the monks really master fermentation, or did they just repeat habits until patterns emerged? Some argue the beer was carefully designed to maximize nutrition. Others think it was more like culinary roulette. You drank what came out of the vat, good or bad, because you had no choice. Either way, the mug in your hand carried more than a drink. It carried survival, community, and devotion. And don't forget, beer as liquid bread wasn't just about feeding bodies. It fed the soul too. Each ration was part of a monastic system that valued order and balance. The very act of brewing and drinking tied monks closer to their rule: work, prayer, sustenance. Nothing wasted, nothing indulgent, everything flowing in measured rhythm. So when you take that next sip in your imagination, let it be more than flavor. Feel the weight of history in it. The countless hands that milled the grain, stirred the mash, and lifted mugs in silence. Beer wasn't a side dish. It was bread reborn, loaf made liquid, faith made drinkable. And somewhere in the dark corners of the cloister, you sensed the quiet joy of men who knew their survival was poured straight into their cups. The refectory grows quieter as you imagine the flickering candles guttering low, and now your attention drifts toward the heavy, leather-bound manuscripts resting on a lectern. The words inside aren't recipes, at least not in the way you'd expect. They are rules, spiritual guidelines, and the one most famous in this cloistered world is the Rule of Saint Benedict. Written in the 6th century, it became the backbone of Western monastic life, a kind of ancient employee handbook with surprisingly strict overtime policies. But tucked into those pages is a small, fascinating clue about drink. Saint Benedict allowed wine, but the text is cautious, always in moderation. Beer, however, slips in through practice, not prescription. It became the loophole that no one seemed to challenge. You can picture it. Monks reading the rule, nodding solemnly, chanting moderation, and then heading straight to the brewery. After all, moderation is relative. If you're copying scripture for 12 hours a day, moderate might look like several hearty mugs. And honestly, who's going to argue? It's not like they had HR to call them in for a disciplinary meeting. The fascinating part is how rules shaped behavior. The monastery wasn't a free-for-all where brothers drank until they toppled over. No, everything was measured, controlled, and folded into routine. Beer wasn't indulgence. It was a tool of structure. Each sip had a time and place, woven into the same rhythm that guided prayer bells. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about order. Historians still debate whether Saint Benedict himself envisioned beer as part of this daily structure, or whether monks added it pragmatically over centuries. The uncertainty lingers like foam on a freshly poured mug. There's also something gently ironic here. The rule emphasized humility, poverty, and simplicity, yet the brewing of beer required resources, skill, and experimentation. Monks became experts almost by accident, because their devotion to labor demanded it. To them, stirring a steaming vat was no less holy than illuminating a manuscript with gold leaf. Ora et labora, pray and work, wasn't just a motto, it was survival. Brewing was work, and therefore it was prayer. Now imagine the scene. A novice monk, new to the cloister, nervously following the rule. He expects endless prayer and silent meals. Instead, he's handed a mug of warm ale at supper. Surprise. Welcome to monastic life. Your first assignment is to learn how to stir the mash without scorching it. That's right, brother. Your path to holiness begins with a wooden paddle. Not exactly what you pictured when you shaved your head and put on the robe. The rule also stressed hospitality. Guests and pilgrims were to be welcomed as Christ himself. And what better way to welcome a weary traveler than with a cup of safe, nourishing beer? Suddenly, the rule isn't just a list of restrictions. It's a doorway into brewing culture. By insisting on generosity and care, Saint Benedict indirectly ensured that beer flowed not only for monks, but for anyone who stumbled onto their doorstep. A sacred obligation turned into a brewing industry, and don't think the rules were just dry text-gathering dust. They were read aloud often, chanted in rhythm, memorized by heart. Imagine sitting in that cold chapel, the abbot's voice echoing through the stone. All things in moderation. The brothers nod, their minds already drifting toward the brewery, where moderation is measured in carefully filled mugs. You almost want to laugh. It's like hearing your teacher say, "Do your homework," and immediately translating it into "find the quickest shortcut." Still, there's discipline here that modern life often lacks. The rule created a balance. No excess, no waste, just enough to sustain. Beer was a servant to that balance, never the master. Even if one brother occasionally sneaked a stronger sip, the framework held. The system kept indulgence in check while still giving comfort. It's the medieval equivalent of having parental controls on your Netflix account, except the restriction was spiritual rather than digital. The rule's influence echoed far beyond the cloister walls. Villagers admired the monks not only for their piety, but also for their reliability. If the monastery brewed, it was safe. If the monastery poured, it was measured. The rule of St. Benedict, without ever naming beer, carved out the space where brewing became both holy duty and everyday routine. And because the rule spread across Europe, so too did this structured culture of brewing. So when you raise that heavy mug in your imagination tonight, remember, you're not just drinking grain and yeast. You're sipping the outcome of a 6th century rulebook, a text meant to tame human weakness, but which, in a roundabout way, gave birth to centuries of brewing tradition. The rule whispered moderation, and the monks answered with bubbling vats and steady hands, and as the candle flames bend low, you sense the irony that makes history so oddly comforting. Rules meant to limit pleasure accidentally created one of the most enduring comforts in human history. Your footsteps take you past the lectern and back toward the heart of the cloister, the brewery itself. Here the monks became more than caretakers of prayer. They were brewers, craftsmen, artisans, with a surprisingly experimental streak. You might think of monks as cloaked figures moving solemnly through shadowy halls, but step into the brewery, and suddenly they look more like medieval scientists. Grain sacks piled high, wooden paddles taller than a man, cauldrons steaming, and that ever-present yeasty perfume clinging to every robe. Welcome to the unexpected laboratory of faith, the monastic brewhouse. Monks developed brewing techniques with a precision that rivals modern craft brewers. Each monastery had its own formula, adapted to local grains and water, seasoned with herbs and, later, hops. No two cloisters brewed quite the same. It was like a patchwork quilt of recipes stitched across Europe, every monastery holding onto a secret twist. One might favor oats for a creamier texture, another barley for strength. If you were lucky enough to travel between abbeys, your taste buds would get a pilgrimage of their own. And here's the fun part. Monks were consistent. Unlike villagers, who brewed when they could and hoped for the best, monasteries had resources and discipline. Brewing schedules were regular. Fermentation was monitored with the same care given to preserving sacred relics. The result? Monastic beer gained a reputation for reliability. If you drank from a monastery mug, you knew you weren't risking sour swamp juice. You were getting the good stuff. In an age when most of life was unpredictable, plagues, bad harvests, Viking raids, consistency was priceless. But consistency didn't mean bland. Monks innovated constantly. They played with ratios of grain, experimented with strength, even layered flavors with herbs. Some monasteries added wildflowers, others used juniper, rosemary, or bog myrtle. You'd never know if your next mug would taste faintly sweet, tart, or medicinal. Think of it as the medieval version of craft beer flights. Only instead of chalkboard menus, you had a brother silently handing you a cup and raising an eyebrow like, well, too much time? Of course, some experiments didn't go as planned. Imagine a poor novice stirring too fast, scorching the mash, and producing a brew that smelled like burnt porridge, or adding the wrong herb and accidentally creating what we might politely call liquid regret. You can picture the other brothers choking it down anyway, muttering prayers that the next batch wouldn't taste like boiled weeds. And yet, every failed experiment taught them something. Slowly, imperceptibly, brewing knowledge advanced. Historians still debate how much of this innovation was conscious science and how much was simply repetition until a pattern emerged. Did monks realize yeast was the invisible force? Probably not. But they observed outcomes, wrote down practices, and avoided mistakes that ruined flavor or made drinkers ill. Over centuries, this trial and error built a brewing tradition far stronger than chance. What's remarkable is how brewing fit seamlessly into monastic identity. Copying manuscripts, tending gardens, caring for the sick, and brewing beer all were considered sacred labor. Brewing wasn't a side hustle. It was vocation. A brother might spend decades perfecting his role as brewmaster, passing down tips to younger novices. In a way, he wasn't just preserving recipes, he was preserving survival, culture, and even joy. And let's not forget the politics. Beer wasn't only for monks. Surplus was shared or sold, and when villagers realized monastery beer was better than their own, demand soared. Soon monasteries weren't just spiritual centers, but economic hubs, respected for the quality of their brews. Some abbots leaned into this role, fostering brewing as both charity and revenue stream. Others worried it bordered on indulgence. After all, when your house of prayer becomes the region's most popular bar, questions are bound to be asked. Imagine, too, the subtle pride in being known as a brewing monastery. Pilgrims whispered, "Ah, this abbey, good beer." Reputation mattered. Just as today we might pick a cafe for its reliable cappuccino, medieval travelers sought out abbeys renowned for their ale. It was branding, monastic style. No slogans, no marketing, just centuries of consistency and word of mouth. And in this steady bubbling of cauldrons, you glimpse the humanity of monks. They weren't ascetic robots removed from the world. They were men who sweated, stirred, tasted, and tinkered. Men who found joy in a well-made drink. Men who took pride when a pilgrim smiled after the first sip. Faith and fermentation were never in conflict here. They were threads of the same tapestry. So tonight, as you picture yourself in that cloister brewery, steam rising, torches flickering against stone, think of the monks not as silent figures bent only in prayer. See them as brewers, sleeves rolled, faces flushed, wooden paddles in hand, crafting beer that nourished body and soul. They were, quite literally, the brewmasters of the Middle Ages. You follow the steam out of the monastery brewhouse and picture the wider world beyond the cloister walls. Out there in the crooked lanes of villages and the smoky kitchens of timber houses, another set of brewers worked their craft, alewives. Women brewed in households long before monasteries industrialized it. Brewing was domestic, as ordinary as baking bread. A pot, some grain, a wooden paddle, and a practiced hand. Suddenly you had beer for your family, your neighbors, maybe even for sale at the market. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the hearth warm and the table supplied. This set up an interesting tension. Monks on the inside, alewives on the outside. Both groups brewed, both were essential, but their worlds collided when monasteries started producing more than they consumed. Picture it like the medieval version of a local cafe struggling when a Starbucks moves in next door, except the Starbucks is a stone abbey with centuries of reputation and a choir to back it up. Alewives had long been keepers of tradition. Their recipes were family secrets, whispered from mother to daughter. Some batches were sweet, others bitter. Some so strong they'd make you wobble after 2 mugs. They sold beer in jugs marked with a broomstick hung over the door, a signal to thirsty passers-by that ale was ready. Imagine walking through a muddy street and spotting that broom. Relief, warmth, and maybe a bit of gossip inside. But as monasteries grew in brewing skill and capacity, they began to dominate the market. Monastic beer was safer, more consistent, less likely to give you the unfortunate 2-day stomach pilgrimage. Villagers started preferring it, and local alewives felt the pinch. Some adapted, finding niches brewing small, flavorful batches. Others faded into the background as the cloister breweries expanded. And here's where the story gets curious. While alewives were brewing out of necessity, monks framed their beer as service to God. One was domestic labor, the other sacred duty. Same process, very different marketing angle. You have to wonder how many alewives rolled their eyes when they heard monks describing fermentation as holy mystery. Holy mystery, please. It's just patience and a clean pot. Historians still debate just how sharp the competition was. Some evidence suggests monasteries wiped out local ale trade in certain regions. Others argue the two coexisted for centuries, serving different needs. It's possible that villagers drank monastery beer when they could afford it, and alewife beer when they couldn't. Or maybe they just drank whatever was closest when thirst hit, which, let's be honest, is exactly what most of us would do. And here's a playful thought. In some towns, an alewife might have brewed a batch that was tastier than the monks. Word spreads, pilgrims whisper, and suddenly the monastery's pride takes a dent. What do you do when a barefoot widow with a broomstick sign outshines your cloister's carefully measured recipe? Maybe you double down on quality. Maybe you add a charitable spin. Or maybe, just maybe, you sneak a taste and take notes. Of course, being an alewife wasn't always safe. Too much success could draw suspicion. Women brewing at home, especially if unmarried or eccentric, sometimes became targets of gossip. A bitter batch could spark rumors of witchcraft. You can almost hear the whisper, "Her beer made my stomach ache, surely she cursed it." Meanwhile, monks burned their bad batches in silence, shielded by stone walls and scripture. The contrast is striking and a little unfair. What's clear is that brewing wasn't just about taste, it was about power. Monasteries had the scale and the blessing of the church. Hellewives had tradition and community. The clash between them tells a story about gender, labor, and the shifting economy of the Middle Ages. Behind every mug of beer, there was more than foam. There was tension, survival, and sometimes resentment. Still, you can picture evenings when villagers gathered in a smoky cottage, sipping ale brewed by a local woman, swapping tales, laughing loudly, while in the monastery down the road, monks quietly sipped their measured rations by candlelight. Two worlds, two brews, one shared love for liquid bread. And as the night air settles around you, you realize that this rivalry, quiet or sharp, kept brewing alive in every corner of medieval Europe. It wasn't just monks in cloisters or women in kitchens, it was both, shaping the taste of history one mug at a time. The monastery grows dimmer in your imagination, torches sputtering as you step closer to the brewery's supply shelves. Instead of hops, the crisp piney cones you know from modern lagers, you find bundles of dried plants tied with twine. Leaves, flowers, seeds, and roots all smelling faintly of earth and spice. Before hops became the universal flavor of beer, medieval brewers leaned on something called gruit. It was a heady mix of herbs, and each batch was its own little gamble. Picture a cauldron simmering with barley mash. A monk leans over, tosses in a pinch of bog myrtle, a handful of yarrow, maybe a sprig of rosemary if the garden was generous. The result? A beer that might taste sharp and bitter, or sweet and floral, or, if the brewer misjudged, like a soggy salad gone wrong. It was less predictable than hops, but it carried its own kind of charm. Every mug was a surprise, and here's the funny part, some of these herbs had, let's call them energetic side effects. Yarrow could give you a light buzz, bog myrtle might make you feel extra dreamy, and wild rosemary in excess could leave you stumbling like you'd tried to dance on cobblestones. Drinking Groot beer wasn't just refreshment, it was a bit of a lottery. One pint left you mellow, another left you convinced the wall was breathing. You never knew. Honestly, it makes modern craft beer flavors like mango IPA look tame. This herbal tradition wasn't random, though. Recipes were guarded like treasure, often controlled by guilds or even sanctioned by local lords who taxed the privilege of using Groot. Yes, you heard that right, herbs were taxed. Imagine paying a fee every time you wanted to throw oregano on your pizza. Brewers back then had to navigate not only taste but politics. A pinch too much of the wrong plant could bring both side effects and suspicious glances. Monks, with their access to gardens and written records, became particularly adept at crafting balanced Groot mixes. They experimented, adjusted, and noted what worked. In some cloisters, brewing started to look like early chemistry labs. Plants labeled neatly, monks sniffing dried bundles, arguments whispered over whether sage or heather gave a smoother finish. Some of those arguments probably got as heated as debates today over pineapple on pizza. Still, the lack of consistency was a real problem. Villagers craved safe, predictable beer, and Groot rarely delivered that. Sometimes the herbs preserved the drink well, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the flavor charmed, sometimes it repelled. And lurking behind it all was the fact that too much of the wrong herb could make your liquid bread into something closer to liquid regret. Historians still puzzle over how intentional these mixtures were. Did brewers truly understand the medicinal and psychotropic effects, or did they just roll with whatever grew nearby? Some argue that Groot was carefully curated for both flavor and health. Others suggest it was more like rummaging through a spice rack in the dark. The debate continues, much like foam refusing to settle on a freshly poured pint. But for all its unpredictability, Groot carried cultural weight. Drinking it was normal, expected, even sacred when brewed in monasteries. Each sip tied people to the land, the seasons, and the hands that gathered herbs from forests and gardens. It was beer in its wild, untamed stage, before hops came along to tidy everything up. You sip in your imagination and feel the difference. Less crisp, more earthy, a strange, lingering aftertaste, like chewing on wildflowers after a rainstorm. Not unpleasant, but unexpected. And you can't help but smile because for those medieval drinkers, this was life. The randomness of Groot mirrored the randomness of their world, unpredictable, sometimes harsh, sometimes delightful. And as you set down your mug in the cloister's shadowy hall, you sense the shift approaching. Hops are coming, quietly waiting in the wings, ready to change brewing forever. But for now, the herbs still hold sway, and each sip is a little prayer to earth, sky, and the stubborn inventiveness of those who brewed before science could explain the magic. The cloister air seems to tremble with anticipation as you step forward past the shelves of dried herbs. You sense a shift, something new entering the scene, sharp and piney, like a forest in a mug. This is the arrival of hops, the plant that would transform brewing forever. At first glance, hops looked like papery green cones, harmless little flowers clinging to vines. But once tossed into a vat, they did something miraculous. They tamed beer's wildness. Imagine that first cautious handful of hops hitting boiling mash. The aroma rises, bitter yet refreshing, cutting through the sweet heaviness of grain. Suddenly, beer tastes different, balanced, longer-lasting, even more stable in storage. What had once been unpredictable, herbal roulette begins to sharpen into something consistent. And consistency, in a medieval world where survival often hinged on reliability, was revolutionary. The first whispers of hops drifted out of Germany around the 9th century. Monks there, ever curious, experimented with this strange vine. At first, not everyone was impressed. Some people complained the flavor was too bitter. Others grumbled that hops were foreign and untrustworthy, like the medieval version of "I liked beer before it got trendy." Yet slowly, sip by sip, hops spread. By the 12th century, they had marched confidently across Europe, carried by monks who realized they had stumbled upon a brewing secret worth keeping. The most powerful advantage of hops wasn't flavor, it was preservation. Herbal Groot beer spoiled quickly. Drink it fast or risk drinking something that had gone sour in a bad way. But with hops, beer lasted. You could store it, ship it, even trade it. For monasteries, this meant surplus beer wasn't wasted. They could brew in bulk, sell more widely, and establish reputations that reached far beyond their cloister walls. Hops turned beer from a fragile household staple into an economic force. And of course, monks weren't shy about leaning into this new advantage. You can almost picture the abbot giving a satisfied nod as barrels of hopped beer rolled out the monastery gate, bound for market towns where eager villagers waited. A product that didn't spoil overnight was a financial blessing. Brewing shifted from survival to enterprise. Suddenly, monasteries weren't just places of prayer. They were proto-businesses, shaping trade routes with their barrels of frothy golden drink. Still, not everyone welcomed hops. Wives who brewed with Groot saw their traditions threatened. Local lords who profited from Groot taxes weren't thrilled either, because hops bypassed their control. Some regions even banned hopped beer for a time, calling it unnatural or unhealthy. Imagine a medieval debate club, one side shouting "herbs forever," and the other insisting, "hops will save us all." The tension simmered, but hops kept winning. Historians still debate how quickly hops overtook Europe. Some regions clung to Groot well into the 14th century, while others embraced hops early. The truth is, transition was patchy, messy, uneven, but by the late Middle Ages, hops had become the undisputed champion, sealing beer's identity for centuries to come. And here's the irony. Monks may have framed hops as a divine gift, a tool to ensure purity and stability. But to the average villager, it was probably just, "Oh, this one tastes better and doesn't make me sick the next morning." Divine or not, practical wins every time. In your imagination, you lift a mug brewed with hops for the very first time. The flavor is sharper, drier, almost medicinal at first sip, but then a strange satisfaction lingers. You realize this beer won't turn to vinegar tomorrow. You could travel with it, celebrate with it, even age it a little. It's the birth of modern beer, unfolding in a stone cloister, where no one fully understood just how big this change was. And as the night deepens around you, the bubbling vats now carry a new scent, resinous, clean, enduring. The monks may not have had the words for it, but you can hear history whisper. Hops have arrived, and brewing will never be the same again. The cloister doors creak open in your mind, and a chill breeze drifts in from the muddy road outside. You hear footsteps, slow, weary, uneven. Pilgrims have arrived. Dust clings to their tunics, their sandals worn thin from miles of walking. They carry scallop shells or wooden staffs, the telltale signs of holy journeys that have tested their strength and patience. And what greets them at the monastery gates? Not gold, not relics, but something far more practical. Beer. Monasteries became lifelines along pilgrimage routes, places where the faithful could rest and drink without fear of poisoned wells or contaminated streams. Imagine trudging across Europe with blisters on your feet, hunger gnawing at your belly, and thirst drying your throat like parchment. Then a monk places a wooden cup in your hand, filled with frothy ale. Safe, nourishing, and if the batch was particularly good, maybe even delicious. In that moment, you'd probably whisper a prayer of gratitude that had nothing to do with relics and everything to do with fermentation. The charity of offering beer wasn't a minor detail. It was a central act of hospitality. The rule of St. Benedict urged monks to welcome guests as Christ himself. And what better welcome than a drink that wouldn't kill you? Pilgrims staggered into abbeys half dead from the road, and a mug of ale might revive them enough to continue. In many ways, monastic beer was the fuel of medieval travel. Forget energy drinks. This was the medieval Red Bull, minus the wings but with plenty of calories. Picture the scene in a guest house attached to the abbey. Rough wooden tables, the air warm with candle smoke, pilgrims murmuring in dozens of accents, each holding a cup of beer. They trade stories, tales of thieves on the road, miraculous healing, storms survived. The monks pour steadily, their silence a counterpoint to the chatter. For some pilgrims, this may have been the safest, most comforting meal of their journey. Beer was nourishment, but also community. Of course, not all pilgrims were pious saints. Some were opportunists, wanderers, or people escaping debts back home. You can imagine a monk raising an eyebrow at a particularly rowdy group, slamming mugs on the table. Charity had limits, and abbots sometimes rationed beer carefully to avoid drunken brawls in the guest house. Still, even the questionable pilgrims received something. Hospitality demanded it, even if the brothers muttered prayers under their breath about those loud fellows from Flanders. Historians still debate how much beer was freely given and how much was sold at low cost. Some argue monasteries operated generous charity, pouring mugs for every weary traveler. Others note the practical strain. Brewing required grain, time, labor. It's likely a mix. Pilgrims received enough to quench their thirst and restore their strength, while larger groups or long stays might require payment or work in exchange. Either way, beer was at the center of the transaction, a liquid form of mercy and survival. And here's a thought that makes you smile. Some pilgrims probably chose their routes based on which monasteries had the best beer. Imagine medieval travel blogs. Top 10 abbeys with refreshing ale along the Camino. You laugh, but human nature hasn't changed. If word spread that an abbey's brew was particularly good, travelers would detour miles just to taste it. Holy devotion, yes, but also a thirst for quality. There's a beautiful irony here. Pilgrimage was about spiritual purification, shedding earthly comforts, suffering for faith. Yet one of the highlights was sipping a foamy mug of ale in a monastery guest house. Maybe salvation and refreshment weren't so different after all. As you listen in your imagination, the murmur of pilgrims fades into soft background noise. The clink of mugs, the low hum of voices, the occasional laugh. It all blends with the crackle of firewood and the bubbling of brewing vats nearby. In this moment, beer becomes not just sustenance but fellowship, a shared drink binding strangers together before they step back into the long, uncertain road. And as you slip back into the shadows of the cloister, you realize how central this was. Without monastic beer, pilgrimages might have been unbearable. With it, they became survivable, even memorable. A sip of ale could mean the difference between collapse and carrying on, between despair and a faint smile in the candlelight. The guest house fades into silence, and now you picture another chamber in the monastery, cool, dim, lined with shelves of jars filled with dried herbs, roots, and powders. This is the infirmary, where monks doubled as caretakers and amateur physicians. Here, beer takes on another surprising role: medicine. To a medieval mind, beer wasn't just food or refreshment, it was part of the pharmacy. Monks prescribed it for ailments ranging from digestive troubles to melancholy. A pint a day keeps the pestilence away. That might as well have been their motto. And in a strange way, they weren't entirely wrong. Beer carried calories for the weak, hydration for the feverish, and mild alcohol that numbed pain and kept harmful bacteria at bay. Imagine a frail pilgrim lying on a straw bed, too weak to eat bread. A monk ladles warm ale into a cup, holds it to the man's lips. Slowly, he sips. The calories trickle in. The warmth steadies him, the liquid soothes a dry throat. In that moment, beer is no indulgence, it's therapy. It's the closest thing to a medieval energy drink, except instead of neon colors and dubious ingredients, you get grain, yeast, and the faint perfume of herbs. And monks didn't stop at plain ale. They infused it with medicinal plants, chamomile for calm, sage for digestion, wormwood for fever. The line between brewing and medicine blurred completely. One mug could be a meal, another a sleeping aid, another a treatment for cough. The brewing room and the infirmary were siblings, connected by the same vats and the same quiet hands. Of course, not every prescription worked. Some herbs added to beer had questionable effects, and the dosage was often whatever seemed right at the time. You can picture a poor novice jotting down notes. Brother Matthew coughed less after 2 mugs. Brother John, however, fell asleep in the garden and missed vespers. Trial and error was the only clinical method available, and error could be well memorable. Historians still debate how much of this was actual healing and how much was placebo. Did the beer truly cure, or did it simply provide comfort in a world where medicine was often harsher than the disease? Bleeding, leeches, purges. Compared to that, a pint of warm ale must have felt like a blessing, and maybe comfort itself was medicine enough. One curious example is the treatment of fevers. Some monks believed cool, weak ale could reduce heat in the body. Others thought strong beer fortified the humors and gave strength. Which was right? Probably neither, at least not in scientific terms. But both approaches show how deeply beer was woven into medical thought. Whether hot or cold, strong or mild, beer was always part of the conversation. And let's not forget childbirth. Records suggest women were sometimes given ale to ease labor pains or to recover afterward. Again, not exactly modern obstetrics, but in an age of limited options, a little liquid comfort went a long way. The idea of monks prescribing ale for new mothers feels odd to us, but to them it was perfectly reasonable. After all, beer nourished the body and lifted the spirit. Why wouldn't it help in times of struggle? Then there's the psychological angle. Monks understood in their way that mood affected health. A mug of ale brought calm, laughter, even a sense of lightness. In a world haunted by famine, plague, and war, that emotional relief mattered. Beer soothed not just the body but the soul. Think of it as medieval Prozac, mild, frothy, and served in wooden mugs. Yet for all this, debate swirled. Some churchmen worried that leaning too heavily on beer blurred the line between healing and indulgence. Was the infirmary really a place of medicine, or just an excuse for extra mugs? The tension never fully resolved, and you can almost hear the muttered complaints of stricter abbots. Brother Thomas prescribes ale far too often. Surely not every cough requires a pint. Still, the reality is clear. Beer as medicine was not a fringe idea, it was mainstream. It was prescribed, trusted, and cherished. For the sick and weary, ale was often the gentlest remedy available. And in a world where most cures were brutal, that gentleness might have been the true healing power. So tonight, as you imagine sipping a warm herbal ale under the vaulted ceiling of a monastic infirmary, remember this. Your medicine might taste like beer, your doctor might wear a robe and tonsure, and your prescription might be drink steadily in moderation. Strange? Yes. Comforting? Absolutely. You slip out of the infirmary in your imagination and wander back toward the brewhouse. Only now you notice something subtle. The vats aren't always bubbling. Brewing was never a year-round constant. It ebbed and flowed with the seasons. Beer was as much a child of weather as it was of grain. In fact, the calendar shaped every sip. Winter was the brewer's friend. The cold slowed spoilage, kept the fermenting mash from souring too quickly, and gave monks time to brew stronger, heartier ales that would last. Imagine the frosty air biting at your cheeks as steam rose from kettles inside. The contrast of chill and warmth making the beer taste even richer. Those winter brews were reliable, heavy with calories, the kind of drink that clung to your ribs when the vegetable gardens lay barren and meat was scarce. Summer, on the other hand, was trickier. Heat spoiled beer faster, yeast grew wild, and contamination crept in like an uninvited guest. Brewing in July could feel like juggling torches. Too many things could go wrong. A batch might sour overnight, turning from nourishing ale into something closer to vinegar. So many monasteries limited brewing in the hottest months, focusing instead on storing what they had made during cooler seasons. You can almost hear a monk sighing as another summer batch fails, muttering a prayer and scraping out the ruined mash with a weary shrug. Autumn was the season of abundance. Freshly harvested grain meant new possibilities, and brewing reached a lively peak. Stronger beers were crafted, intended to last through winter feasts and fasting periods alike. There's a kind of joy in that image. Monks bustling, mills grinding, kettles steaming. Everyone working with purpose because the harvest meant opportunity. Autumn beers carried the spirit of plenty, golden and full-bodied, brewed while fields still smelled of cut straw and the air hinted at frost. Spring, meanwhile, was transitional, leaner months, when supplies were running low, but fields had not yet yielded their bounty. Beer brewed then was often lighter, weaker, sometimes stretched with oats or whatever grains were left in the storeroom. It was survival beer, plain and practical. Not the kind of ale that made you sing, but the kind that kept you alive. And let's not forget the festivals tied to these rhythms. Feast days often coincided with the release of strong, rich brews. Monks might sip heavier ale on Easter or Christmas, while pilgrims arriving in spring were given thinner, more modest cups. The liturgical year and the brewing calendar intertwined, so that taste itself became part of the rhythm of worship and celebration. What's funny is how familiar this feels if you think about modern craft beer culture. Today, breweries release pumpkin ales in autumn, light pilsners in summer, hearty stouts in winter. Back then, the monks were doing the same thing. Only they didn't call it seasonal marketing, they called it survival. Historians still debate how much climate shaped brewing choices versus pure tradition. Was winter beer stronger because it brewed better, or because monks wanted comfort in the cold? Was summer brewing really avoided everywhere or just in certain regions? The evidence is patchy, and the debates bubble on like yeast in a vat. But what's undeniable is that beer was never static. It reflected the turning of the year, the chill of December, the abundance of September, the hunger of March. To drink monastic beer was to drink the seasons themselves. You can almost taste it now, a frothy, dark winter ale warming your chest, a thin, tangy spring brew, a little rough around the edges but nourishing, a full-bodied autumn cup bursting with harvest energy. Each sip carried the calendar, as if time itself was brewed into the mug. And as you leave the brewhouse in your imagination, you notice how the monks glanced at the sky as often as the kettle, knowing that the sun, the frost, the rains all had their say in every batch. Beer wasn't just made by monks, it was made by seasons. The path turns downward now, into the belly of the monastery. Your sandals scrape across stone steps as the air cools with every stride. Torches flicker against walls slick with moisture, and then you reach it, the cellars. Here is where the true secret of medieval brewing hid, not in the mash tun or the boiling kettle, but in the earth itself. These underground chambers were the monastery's refrigerator, long before anyone dreamed of humming machines or ice boxes. The stone vaults trapped the chill of winter and held it through summer, keeping beer from spoiling, slowing the restless hunger of bacteria. You can almost feel the damp air brushing your face, carrying the tang of oak casks, the faint sour sweet of fermentation in slumber. Rows of barrels line the cellar, massive casks bound with iron hoops, each one cradling precious liquid. The monks knew that time mattered. A few weeks in cool stone darkness could turn rough young ale into something smoother, safer and more desirable. It wasn't aging in the modern sense. Nobody was storing beer for years, but even a modest rest in the cellar gave it strength. Imagine a monk lowering a candle to check the barrels, tapping gently with a mallet to test the wood, listening for hollow notes. He's less a brewer now and more a guardian, ensuring the treasure inside remains unspoiled. If you listen closely, you might even hear the faint sigh of fermenting ale, the soft fizz of bubbles escaping. It's like the beer is breathing. In summer, these cellars became lifelines. While villagers struggled with quick-souring homebrew, monasteries could draw mugs from casks that had rested cool and steady. This advantage gave monastic beer its edge, safe, reliable, available year-round. No wonder pilgrims detoured for it. No wonder markets buzzed with its reputation. The cellars also shaped flavor. The temperature slowed fermentation, giving the ale a cleaner profile than wild, hot-brewed village beer. It wasn't lager. True lagers would come later, but it was a step closer to refinement. Sip a cellar-aged monastic ale, and you'd notice the difference immediately. Smoother, less sharp, more stable. Of course, not everything was perfect. Moisture in the air could rot wood. Rats loved the grain-rich scent, and mold crept along stone walls like an unwelcome guest. Monks fought these battles constantly, scrubbing, patching, praying. Sometimes barrels leaked, soaking into the earth. Sometimes an entire batch went sour despite the chill. You can almost picture the collective groan echoing through the cloister when a cask was lost. Historians still debate whether monks understood the science of cool storage or simply stumbled into it. Did they know lower temperatures slowed spoilage, or did they just notice that beer kept better underground? Likely the latter. But intention hardly mattered. The results spoke for themselves. The cellar was as holy a tool as any altar. And here's a thought. Those cool echoing chambers must have felt otherworldly. Candlelight barely piercing the darkness. The smell of damp oak and yeast. The silence broken only by the occasional drip of water. For monks who believed every act of labor was prayer, tending to the cellars must have felt almost mystical. A hidden ritual beneath the earth, guarding sustenance for the community. You take a sip in your imagination, a cup poured fresh from a cask deep in the cellar. The beer is cool on your lips, almost refreshing compared to the warm, heavy ales upstairs. It's not sparkling, no bubbles yet, but it carries the whisper of freshness, the taste of something preserved against time. You realize that in these vaults lies the beginning of controlled brewing, the first step toward the crisp beers we know today. And as you climb back toward the cloister, the chill clinging to your robe, you understand why these cellars mattered so much. They weren't just storage, they were survival, innovation, and a touch of mystery. Beneath the chanting above, the monastery breathed quietly underground, keeping beer alive in the dark. The cellar air lingers on your skin as you step back into the cloister halls, and now the story shifts toward the mugs themselves. Not every beer poured in a monastery was the same. There was a hierarchy, strong beer and small beer. Two siblings from the same mash, but worlds apart in strength, purpose, and reputation. Strong beer was the crown jewel, brewed with extra grain, richer in body, heavier with alcohol. It was the beer of feast days, celebrations, and special occasions. Picture Christmas in the monastery. Candles blazing brighter than usual, chants echoing with more vigor, mugs of dark, hearty ale lifted high. That strong beer was more than drink. It was festivity in liquid form, a rare indulgence permitted under the rule's careful eye. For once, moderation bent a little, allowing warmth to seep deeper into bellies and hearts. Small beer, by contrast, was everyday survival. Thin, weak, often made from second or even third runnings of the same mash, it carried only a whisper of alcohol, but enough nutrition to count as sustenance. Children drank it. Laborers carried it to the fields. Monks sipped it between prayers. Imagine something closer to grainy water with a hint of sourness, humble, practical, but safe. If strong beer was velvet and gold, small beer was burlap and wood. The process was clever. After the first rich wort was drained for strong beer, water was poured over the mash again to extract what remained. This weaker brew became the daily ration, stretching resources while ensuring no grain was wasted. Wastefulness was frowned upon in monasteries, and small beer turned leftovers into life-giving liquid. A lesson in economy wrapped in a mug. Of course, the difference in experience was obvious. Strong beer gave warmth, maybe even a faint buzz. Small beer barely lifted your spirits, offering instead a steady trickle of calories. You can imagine a monk sighing at his thin cup during Lent, dreaming of the robust brew that would flow at Easter. Yet both had their place in the rhythm of cloister life, balancing indulgence with humility. Historians still debate just how weak small beer really was. Some argue it had almost no alcohol, barely more than flavored water. Others suggest it carried enough strength to dull thirst and steady nerves. The truth probably varied with each monastery and each season. But the symbolism was clear. There was beer for celebration and beer for survival. And knowing the difference mattered, this divide also echoed in society outside monastery walls. Nobles might reserve strong beer for banquets, while peasants lived on small beer. The same pattern repeated in cloisters, though perhaps with less extravagance. Even in prayerful silence, humans couldn't escape hierarchy. There was always a stronger and a weaker, a feast and a fast, and yet the existence of both beers bound people together. Whether sipping the thin brew of everyday life, or savoring the dark richness of a holiday cup, everyone shared in the same cycle. Strong beer reminded you of joy. Small beer reminded you of resilience. Together they formed a balance that mirrored life itself, moments of abundance, stretches of scarcity, all carried in the same humble mugs. You take an imaginary sip now, one mug bold and warming, another watery and plain. Both carry history, both carry survival. And in the monastery both were essential, shaping the rhythm of body and spirit across the seasons. The rhythm of bells fills your imagination again, tolling through the stone halls, marking hours, days, and seasons. Life in the cloister was ruled not just by prayer, but by the calendar of feast and fast. And beer, ever adaptable, slipped perfectly into both. Feast days were bursts of color in an otherwise grey routine. When the abbey celebrated Christmas, Easter, or the feast of a local saint, the tables filled with richer bread, more generous portions of cheese, and mugs brimming with strong beer. You can picture the brothers gathered in the refectory, candlelight dancing on their tonsured heads, voices raised in chant before lowering to laughter and conversation. The ale was darker, sweeter, more potent. Beer brewed not only to nourish but to gladden hearts. If you'd spent weeks sipping thin, small beer, that first gulp of feast day ale must have felt like velvet pouring down your throat. And then came the fasts. Long stretches of the year when food was stripped away, meat forbidden, sometimes even dairy and eggs removed from the table. But beer remained. The monks reasoned that liquid didn't break the fast. No chewing, no sin. So mugs of small beer became lifelines, carrying calories and comfort when plates sat bare. Liquid bread wasn't just a phrase. It was the loophole that kept monks standing during Lent or Advent. You imagine them filing silently into the refectory, bowls empty, mugs full, sipping slowly as hunger gnawed, but never fully overcame them. The contrast was stark. 1 month ale was celebration, joy foaming over in a mug. The next it was survival, a thin stream of nourishment in place of solid meals. Feast and fast, abundance and restraint. The duality etched itself into every sip. Beer became the bridge between extremes, bending with the rhythm of sacred time. Of course, not everyone agreed where the line should be drawn. Some stricter abbots grumbled that even beer was indulgence during fasting, while others leaned into the loophole, insisting that God surely understood the need for sustenance. Historians still debate how strictly these fasts were observed, and whether monks sometimes stretched definitions a little too creatively. After all, when your mug of liquid bread is strong enough to make you sway, maybe the fast isn't quite as austere as advertised, but there's something very human in that flexibility. Faith demanded sacrifice, yet bodies demanded survival. Beer offered a middle path, a way to honor the fast without collapsing in the chapel. It was compromise poured in a cup. And honestly, who among us hasn't looked for a loophole in a diet or resolution? Medieval monks were no different, only their loophole was tastier. The villagers noticed this too. Feast day beers sometimes spilled beyond cloister walls, shared or sold to nearby communities. Fasts also influenced local rhythms. When the monks leaned on small beer, so did the people around them. The liturgical year, with its ups and downs, spread its influence through brewing as much as through prayer. You imagine it now, the same beer, poured into 2 different contexts. On a feast day, laughter rising with each sip. On a fast, silence heavy, mugs lifted with gratitude rather than cheer. The liquid is the same, but the meaning shifts, shaped by the calendar. Beer became not just nourishment but ritual, a sacrament of ordinary life, bending between celebration and restraint. And as the bells echo in your ears, you realize that the real miracle wasn't that monks brewed beer. It was that beer could carry so many roles at once: feast and fast, joy and survival, indulgence and obedience. The same froth, endlessly adaptable, flowing through the sacred rhythms of time. The bells fade, and now you notice another rhythm altogether: the clink of coins, the murmur of trade, the rustle of sacks of grain. Because in the medieval monastery, beer was never just nourishment or ritual, it was currency. Imagine a world where mugs of ale could stand in for money, where your day's work might be measured not in silver, but in pints. Welcome to the surprisingly liquid economy of monastic brewing. Laborers who worked the abbey's fields often received beer as part of their wages. A few hours scything barley? Here's your daily ration. You can almost see the workers lining up at the brewhouse door, clay jugs in hand, grinning as froth spills over the rim. Beer paid not only for sweat but for loyalty. In a world where coins were scarce and barter ruled, liquid bread was as good as gold. And it wasn't only field hands. Carpenters repairing monastery roofs, masons shaping stone, even pilgrims lending a hand in exchange for shelter, all might be rewarded with beer. It was practical. Everyone needed hydration and calories, so why not pay them with something that nourished both body and spirit? Modern companies hand out pizza on overtime nights. Monasteries handed out ale. This system blurred the line between sustenance and transaction. Beer became a unit of exchange, quietly greasing the wheels of economy. A gallon here, a mug there, each one worth something tangible. Villagers who couldn't pay taxes in coin might deliver grain to the monastery, knowing it would come back to them transformed into beer. Trade wasn't just measured in weight or number, but in frothy mugs that could be poured, shared, and consumed. Historians still debate how far this beer as currency system went. Was it mainly local, a convenience for laborers, or did beer truly circulate as a standard form of payment? The evidence is patchy, but records show that monasteries kept detailed accounts of beer rations, carefully balancing production against obligations. It wasn't casual generosity, it was bookkeeping with froth. And here's a funny image, a laborer haggling with a monk over the value of his day's work. "That roof beam took me all afternoon, brother. Surely it's worth more than a pint and a crust of bread?" The monk sighs, adjusts the tally, and grudgingly ladles out a second mug. Negotiations sealed with foam on the lip. Beer's role as currency also gave monasteries social power. To control brewing was to control not only hydration, but also wages. Villagers grew dependent on monastic supply, and with dependence came influence. An abbot who cut rations could spark unrest. One who was generous earned loyalty. Beer wasn't just drink, it was leverage. And sometimes generosity flowed beyond obligation. During lean harvests, monasteries might distribute weak ale to the poor, keeping communities alive when grain alone couldn't stretch. To the villagers, this was charity. To the monks, it was duty. To history, it looks like one more example of how beer blurred lines between food and drink, between gift and wage, between survival and power. You sip in your imagination and realize how strange this sounds to modern ears. Imagine clocking out of work and being handed a six-pack instead of a paycheck. Absurd? Maybe. But in a world short on coins and long on thirst, it made perfect sense. Beer was stability, sustenance, and salary all at once. So the next time you raise a glass, think of those medieval workers trudging home, jugs sloshing, wages heavy, not in pockets, but in hands. Beer was money, beer was bread, beer was life, and the monasteries minted it one barrel at a time. The clink of those imaginary coins fades, replaced by the splash of liquid into vats and the careful scratch of quills across parchment. Here in the brewing chamber, monks became more than caretakers of survival. They turned into architects of flavor. Every scoop of grain, every pinch of herbs or hops, every decision about timing shaped not just sustenance but taste. It might surprise you to think of monks as flavor enthusiasts, but they were. Brewing was repetitive, yes, but within that repetition came curiosity. What if the barley was roasted longer? What if a little extra wheat was added? How would rosemary compare to sage? Each experiment added layers to beer's personality, slowly moving it from safe liquid bread toward crafted beverage. You can imagine the scene. One monk bending over a bubbling kettle, sniffing steam like a chef testing a soup. Another jotting down notes with ink-stained fingers. Their goal wasn't indulgence, but improvement. And improvement meant more consistent nutrition, longer preservation, and yes, better taste. The abbey that brewed good beer earned pilgrims' praise and villagers' loyalty. Reputation mattered, and reputation came from flavor. Sometimes these experiments were small tweaks. Sometimes they were bold leaps, like mixing unusual grains or adding honey for sweetness. A successful batch brought quiet pride. A failed one brought grimaces, and perhaps a lesson written in the margins. Never again add that much sage. It's strangely comforting to think of monks making the same trial-and-error choices modern. Homebrewers still make today, historians still debate how intentional this innovation was. Were monks consciously chasing better flavor? Or were they simply fixing mistakes and stumbling into improvement? Probably both. They didn't understand yeast enzymes or fermentation chemistry, but they understood results. A smoother beer, a brighter taste, a batch that lasted longer. They noticed and remembered. Over centuries, that memory turned into tradition, and tradition laid the groundwork for brewing science. One of the most fascinating parts is how monastic experimentation spread. Traveling monks carried recipes from abbey to abbey, adjusting them to local grain, water, and herbs. What started as isolated experiments turned into a continental dialogue of flavors. Beer brewed in Flanders tasted different from Bavaria, but threads of similarity ran through them all, woven by curious brothers comparing notes across borders. And don't imagine this was all solemn seriousness. Flavor brought joy, and joy crept into cloisters as surely as prayer. Picture a novice sneaking a sip of a newly finished batch, his eyes widening at its unexpected smoothness, or an older brother giving the faintest smile after tasting a brew better than last year's. Monks may have lived under vows of silence, but you can bet a few raised eyebrows and knowing glances carried whole conversations when the beer turned out especially well. In their pursuit of balance, monks unintentionally pioneered ideas that still define beer today. Malted grain for depth, hops for bite, herbs for nuance. Each was tested, weighed, remembered. The architecture of flavor grew brick by brick, batch by batch. And though they never wrote brew manuals in the modern sense, the habits they passed on became blueprints. You sip along in your imagination and taste their labor. Not refined, not sparkling, but purposeful. Each note, sweet grain, bitter herb, faint yeastiness, feels like a step in a long staircase, climbing toward the beers we know now. The monks weren't trying to invent craft beer. They were simply seeking better sustenance, but in doing so they left footprints we still follow. So when you picture them tonight, don't see only silent figures bent in prayer. See them as architects, designing not cathedrals of stone but cathedrals of flavor, layering taste upon taste, each batch another experiment in the art of drinkable devotion. You leave the steaming brewhouse in your imagination and linger on one question that haunted the monks. Why does beer even work? Grain, water, herbs, left alone, they bubble and transform into something nourishing. But the mechanism? That was invisible. To medieval eyes, fermentation was pure mystery. Monks stirred vats and watched the froth rise, listened to the hiss of escaping gas, smelled the sharp tang of alcohol forming. They had no idea about yeast, no microscopes to reveal tiny cells feasting on sugar. To them it was alchemy, or perhaps even a small miracle. Grain and water went in, and out came beer. If that's not divine intervention, what is? Imagine a novice standing over his first batch, eyes wide as foam blooms like a living creature. "Brother, the beer is alive." And the elder nods solemnly, as though it were an article of faith. Brewing wasn't just labor. It was a brush with the supernatural. In truth, their descriptions make it sound mystical. Some monks wrote of spirits waking in the mash. Others believed angels watched over fermenting vats, keeping rot at bay. The invisible force was sacred, untouchable, inexplicable. And in a way, they weren't wrong. It was life at work, just too small for them to see. This sense of mystery added a spiritual aura to brewing. If every bubble was God's will, then each sip was a holy gift. Beer became not just survival, not just flavor, but an emblem of divine generosity. After all, what else could explain why simple grain and water turned into something safer and stronger than either on their own? Historians still debate how much monks truly observed patterns in fermentation. Some argue they recognized that cleanliness and timing mattered, even if they didn't know why. Others think they simply trusted tradition, repeating steps like incantations. The evidence suggests a little of both, careful observation wrapped in mystical explanation. And here's where the humor creeps in. You can almost hear a monk scolding a novice. "Don't leave the vat uncovered, the demons of the air will spoil it." Which, if you think about it, is basically a medieval way of saying contamination is bad. Science hidden in superstition. Fermentation's mystery also made beer different from bread. Bread rose too, yes, but faster, simpler. Beer took days, sometimes weeks, to reveal its transformation. The long wait deepened the sense of awe. Each batch was like watching a hidden drama unfold behind the curtain of wooden casks. By the time it was ready to drink, the beer carried not just calories, but wonder. And maybe that's why monks embraced brewing so fully. It wasn't just a job. It was a daily miracle, a reminder that the world still held mysteries beyond human grasp. Even the most learned brother, fluent in scripture and philosophy, could only shrug and say, It works because God wills it. You take a sip in your imagination now, and for a moment you share their wonder. The froth tickles your lips, the taste hums on your tongue, and you realize you're drinking a mystery older than science. The monks didn't need microscopes to sense the sacred. They just needed a bubbling vat and patience. So as the candles gutter low in the cloister, you feel the quiet awe of men who brewed with faith, not formulas, trusting that unseen forces would turn grain and water into the lifeblood of their world. To them, every cup was proof. The invisible could nourish the visible, and mystery could live in every swallow. The froth of mystery still clings in your mind as you descend back toward the cellar. Only now your eyes catch on something massive and practical. The casks. Huge oak barrels, bound with iron hoops, their sides darkened by years of damp air and slow seepage. These weren't just storage vessels. They were the muscles of monastic brewing, strong enough to hold gallons upon gallons of precious beer. Picture a monk leaning his full weight against one of these casks, listening for a hollow thump, testing for leaks. The smell of oak mingles with yeast and damp stone, a perfume of survival and patience. Each barrel was a fortress, protecting beer from spoilage, from pests, from the whims of heat. Without these casks, brewing would have been a fleeting miracle. Beer would spoil within days. With them, it could last long enough to be shared, sold, even transported, and transport mattered. Beer wasn't meant only for the cloister anymore. Pilgrims carried word of it far and wide, and soon townsfolk wanted a taste. Imagine ox-drawn. Carts creaking down muddy tracks, barrels swaying precariously. Monks walking beside them to ensure no precious drop spilled. A convoy of liquid bread, rolling across the countryside like a slow-motion river of foam. Of course, moving beer wasn't without problems. Roads were rough, barrels sometimes burst, and sloshing ale could loosen hoops. You can almost hear the curses of a lay brother scrambling to save a leaking cask in the middle of nowhere. And yet, despite the hazards, monasteries learned how to move their product further and further afield. Beer became not just nourishment for monks and pilgrims, but a commodity that linked abbey and town. These casks also shaped the beer itself. Oak lent a faint woody note, sometimes sweet, sometimes tannic. Over time, the barrels became seasoned, holding echoes of every batch brewed before. Drink enough monastery beer, and you might taste the ghost of past brews lingering in the grain. Modern brewers would call this complexity. Monks might have just called it providence. Historians still debate how advanced monastic coopers were. Did they make barrels as tight as modern ones, or were leaks just part of the process? Evidence suggests the craft was impressive even then. Monks or hired coopers fashioned casks that could withstand long journeys, sturdy enough to become the backbone of Europe's beer trade. Without barrels, there would have been no beer economy, just local mugs drained too quickly to matter. And here's a little irony to savor. The same monasteries that preached stability and silence were also hubs of constant movement. Barrels rolled out, coins rolled in, and pilgrims carried memories of a good drink to the ends of Christendom. Faith may have anchored them, but beer kept them connected. You can imagine the scene in a market square. A cart creaks to a halt, a monk taps a cask, and villagers gather with mugs and jugs. Froth spills, laughter rises, coins clink. For a moment, the monastery's influence stretches far beyond stone walls and cloister chants. Beer becomes its messenger, oak-bound and foam-topped, rolling across muddy roads like an unspoken gospel of grain. Take a sip in your imagination. Cool, faintly woody, slightly rough from the journey. You taste the monastery, the cellar, the road dust clinging to the barrel hoops. You taste the effort of men who guarded their liquid treasure through miles of uncertain terrain. And as the scene fades, you realize the truth. Beer didn't just sit in cloisters. It traveled, it traded, it built bridges between sacred halls and secular markets. The casks were more than storage. They were the wheels of history carrying liquid bread across a thirsty world. The clatter of carts and casks fades, and now your ears catch a different sound. The rustle of silk, the snap of banners in the wind, the low murmur of nobles discussing taxes. Because beer, once a humble solution to dirty water, had grown into something far larger, a source of power. And wherever there was power, lords and kings were never far behind. Monasteries didn't just brew for themselves anymore. Their barrels flowed into villages, markets, even cities. And the more popular their beer became, the more rulers noticed. A good brew meant steady income, and steady income meant influence. You can picture an abbot seated across from a local lord, each with a mug in hand, negotiating rights and taxes. The ale between them wasn't just drink, it was leverage. Kings, too, caught on. Beer could be taxed, regulated, controlled. A monarch's coffers grew heavier each time a barrel rolled out of a monastery gate. Some rulers granted monasteries privileges, like exclusive brewing rights, in exchange for loyalty and a steady cut of the profits. Others tightened their grip, demanding higher dues, threatening penalties for untaxed brewing. The abbeys, caught between devotion and survival, walked a fine line. Brew too little and they lost influence. Brew too much and they attracted the king's greedy gaze. And here's the irony. Monasteries sworn to humility and simplicity sometimes became economic giants thanks to their brewing. A single abbey's beer might sustain not only monks, but entire communities, turning abbots into reluctant power players. Imagine a pious brother insisting, "We brew only for charity," while quietly counting barrels destined for noble feasts. Historians still debate just how political monastic brewing became. Some evidence suggests abbeys remained modest, their influence exaggerated by later Romanticism. Others argue monasteries were major players, wielding brewing rights like weapons in local disputes. Perhaps the truth as usual lies in the middle. Not empires, but certainly powers, quiet, subtle, foamy powers, and of course power brings scandal. There are tales of abbots accused of selling beer at unfair prices, of monasteries hoarding grain during famines, of lords accusing monks of overstepping their spiritual bounds. You can almost hear the sarcasm in a villager's voice. "Ah yes, the brothers are fasting, on strong ale, while the rest of us chew bark." The balance between holiness and business was fragile, and beer often tipped the scales, but beer also made monasteries indispensable. A local lord might sneer at an abbot's sermons, but he couldn't sneer at the barrels that kept his soldiers hydrated or his feasts merry. In some ways, monasteries brewed themselves into protection, too valuable to crush, too useful to ignore. A sword might win a battle, but a cask of ale won loyalty. You sip in your imagination now and taste the tension. A drink that was supposed to symbolize humility now carried the weight of politics. Foam that floated between altar and throne, binding monks and kings in a partnership of necessity. And as you set down the mug, you realized that beer wasn't just liquid bread anymore. It was currency, diplomacy, influence. In the quiet froth of a monastery vat, whole kingdoms found reason to smile, or reason to tax. The echo of noble voices drifts away, and now your path winds into the bustling streets outside the cloister walls. Towns are growing, markets are swelling, and with them, something new begins to rise, brewing guilds. If monasteries were the silent powerhouses of ale, guilds were the noisy, organized defenders of it. Picture a medieval town square, stalls piled with bread, fish and cloth, the air thick with smoke from hearths. In the middle of it all, a group of brewers, men and women both, stand together, united not just by their mugs but by their rules. Brewing guilds formed to protect secrets, ensure quality and, let's be honest, to make sure no one undersold the others. They were part craft collective, part labor union, part medieval mafia. These guilds guarded recipes like treasure. They knew how much grain to use, how long to boil, how to season with herbs or hops. Apprentices were sworn to secrecy, learning the trade slowly like an initiation into a mystery cult. Only instead of robes and firelight, you got malt and steam. To break a guild's trust was to risk exile from the trade, maybe even punishment. Imagine being the medieval whistleblower. Brother Martin leaked the recipe for the Christmas ale, banish him. The arrival of guilds meant monasteries no longer had brewing entirely to themselves. Now towns had their own professional class of brewers, regulated, inspected, and fiercely protective. This made competition sharper. Monks brewed for charity and survival, but guilds brewed for profit, and profit demanded consistency. If a guild member brewed a bad batch, customers complained, fines were levied, reputations ruined. Where monasteries had prayer to back them up, guilds had civic law, and yet there was overlap. Some guild brewers learned from monks, some monks borrowed ideas from guilds. Knowledge slipped back and forth, whispered in markets, exchanged through apprenticeships, or simply stolen by a sharp-eyed novice. Brewing became less a cloistered secret and more a public profession. Still, Monks held on to their aura of reliability, while guilds built reputations on skill and rules. Historians still debate how adversarial this relationship really was. Were guilds and monasteries locked in rivalry, or did they coexist serving different audiences? Some argue guilds targeted townsfolk, while monasteries focused on pilgrims and villagers. Others insist abbeys and guilds fought fiercely for markets, each trying to undercut the other. The truth, as always, probably depended on the town. There's also the matter of secrecy. Guilds didn't just protect recipes, they protected mystique. The idea that brewing required special knowledge elevated brewers above ordinary trades. Much like monks invoking divine mystery for fermentation, guilds wrapped themselves in the cloak of expertise. Brewing wasn't just boiling grain. It was an art only insiders truly understood. And the public, awed or intimidated, trusted them. And here's where the humor comes in. Imagine a guild master wagging a finger at a villager. No, you cannot brew your own. Leave it to us or risk a fine. All the while, in the monastery a mile away, monks are quietly ladling out mugs to pilgrims for free. No wonder villagers sometimes preferred the abbey. They weren't going to get a lecture with their pint. Yet the rise of guilds was inevitable. As towns swelled, demand outpaced what monasteries alone could supply. Brewing had to become an organized trade, with rules, apprenticeships, and enforcement. The guilds stepped into that space, turning beer into a professional product as much as a sacred one. You sip in your imagination now. A pint brewed not by silent monks, but by bustling guild members in a noisy town square. The taste is sharper, perhaps more polished, carrying the weight of civic pride rather than monastic devotion. 2 mugs, 2 worlds, each shaping the history of beer in its own way. And as you set down the cup, you realize the story is widening. Beer is no longer just survival in cloisters. It is commerce, reputation, and civic identity. Secrets are guarded, recipes protected, barrels counted. Brewing has stepped fully into the public stage. The clang of the guild hall doors fades behind you, and suddenly the air smells a little off. Because where there is power, profit, and popularity, there are also shortcuts and scandals. Medieval brewing, for all its holiness and civic pride, had its darker, sometimes laughable corners. Not every mug was a miracle. Some were disasters dressed in froth. Monasteries, despite their vows, weren't immune. When grain ran short or when abbots pressed for more revenue, corners got cut. Imagine lifting your mug only to taste something suspiciously earthy because a brewer had stretched the mash with peas, beans, or even tree bark. Yes, really. Desperate times called for desperate ingredients, and not every experiment was successful. Villagers gossiped when beer turned sour too quickly. Rumors spread that monks added chalk to disguise acidity, or dumped in herbs not for flavor, but to hide rot. "This batch tastes funny," someone might whisper, and suddenly half the town is convinced the abbey poisoned them. In truth, most of it was poor luck, but scandal never needed much fuel. Guild brewers weren't spotless either. To protect profits, some slipped cheap fillers into the mash, oats, rye husks, or even dust swept from floors. Others reused spent grain far past its usefulness, producing beer so weak it barely deserved the name. And if customers complained, well, sometimes guild enforcers were quicker to silence critics than fix recipes. Brewing secrets were guarded fiercely, but not always honorably. Historians still debate how widespread these scandals were. Some argue they were rare exceptions, magnified by satirical writers who loved poking fun at monks and guilds alike. Others suggest adulteration was common, a fact of life when resources were thin and oversight weak. Either way, enough records survive to remind us. Not every pint was pure devotion. And of course there were the superstitions. A bad batch might be blamed on demons spoiling the vat, or on a rival casting curses. Imagine a monk solemnly sprinkling holy water over a kettle, convinced evil spirits lurked in the foam. Meanwhile, the real culprit was just poor sanitation. Still, the story stuck, and brewing scandals sometimes took on the air of moral failings rather than technical mishaps. You can almost laugh at the image, an abbot scolding his brewmaster. "Brother, why does this ale taste like cabbage soup?" While the poor man mutters excuses about spirits and omens. It's a reminder that behind the solemn chanting, monks were just as human as anyone else, prone to mistakes, tempted to cut corners, sometimes caught in the crossfire of scandal. Yet scandals also spurred change. Guilds cracked down with inspections, abbeys tightened rules, and consumers grew sharper in their judgments. Bad beer didn't just damage a mug, it damaged reputations. Monasteries prized their good name too highly to let it slip often. Every scandal, whether whispered or shouted, pushed brewing toward higher standards. So you sip in your imagination, half wincing at the thought of what might have been hidden in your mug centuries ago. Maybe it's wholesome grain and hops. Maybe it's a dash of ground beans or worse. Either way, you understand the stakes. Beer wasn't only survival, it was trust. And when that trust broke, scandal brewed faster than yeast in summer heat. The sting of scandal lingers in the air, but now you turn a corner and see a different side of brewing, one softer, humbler, and far more generous. Because monasteries didn't just brew for themselves or for profit, or even for pilgrims. They brewed for the poor. Picture the abbey gates on a cold morning, ragged villagers clustered outside, cloaks pulled tight, hands empty except for jugs and bowls. Hunger gnaws at them, thirst dries their lips. A lay brother appears with a ladle and a barrel of weak, watery beer, the kind called small ale. It isn't strong, it isn't rich, but it is safe. A mug fills a stomach better than plain water, carrying calories enough to keep someone standing through another day. For the poor, this was more than charity. It was survival. In times of famine, when bread dwindled and fields failed, monasteries became lifelines. Beer brewed thin and stretched as far as possible became a kind of communal safety net. It's not glamorous to imagine, but those humble mugs might have saved entire villages from collapse. Of course, abbots understood the politics too. A monastery known for generosity earned goodwill and protection from the people around it. A stingy monastery, by contrast, could expect resentment, even unrest. So charity was both holy duty and practical strategy. Beer soothed hunger, but it also soothed tempers. Historians still debate how widespread this charity was. Were monasteries pouring mugs daily at their gates, or only during seasons of famine? Was the beer given freely, or was it sometimes tied to labor or loyalty? The records are unclear, but enough accounts survive to prove that the poor did indeed drink from monastic barrels. And here's a striking image: a barefoot child clutching a clay mug too big for her hands, gulping down beer that was weaker than milk, but steadier than water. Or an old man sipping slowly, eyes closing in relief as warmth spreads through his chest. For them, this wasn't indulgence. It was grace in liquid form. There's even a kind of humor in imagining the line at the gates. Villagers muttering complaints about the watery brew. Couldn't they spare a stronger pint? While still returning day after day, because weak beer was better than no beer at all. Human nature hasn't changed much. We still grumble about free things not being good enough. The generosity also tied back into theology. Feeding the poor was feeding Christ himself, monks believed. Every ladle of beer poured into a peasant's mug was a prayer in action, a silent blessing disguised as foam. No sermons needed, just steady hands and open barrels. You sip in your imagination now, tasting the thinness, the lightness, the absence of strength. Yet behind that plain taste is a deeper sweetness, survival. That mug, humble as it was, carried mercy. And in the long arc of history, sometimes mercy mattered more than richness. So as the bells toll again, you see the monastery not as a fortress of privilege, but as a wellspring of survival, pouring weak beer for the poor and keeping whole communities alive, one frothy ladle at a time. The clatter of mugs for the poor fades, and now your thoughts drift back beyond the cloister gates, into the homes and smoky kitchens where women once brewed openly. Alewives had carried the craft for centuries, their broom-marked doors welcoming neighbors to buy a jug of frothy drink. Yet as monasteries and guilds expanded, women's role in brewing began to slip into the shadows. Picture an alewife in a linen apron, sleeves rolled, stirring a steaming pot over her hearth. Children run underfoot, grain dust clings to her hair and the smell of malt fills the room. She isn't brewing for indulgence. She's brewing for survival, for income, for family. For generations, this was ordinary work, as natural as baking bread. But slowly, this everyday labor was overshadowed. Monasteries, with their vast resources, produced beer on a scale no household could match. Guilds, with their rules and protections, began to edge women out of the urban trade. Brewing shifted from domestic necessity to regulated profession, and women, who had long been the backbone of it, found themselves excluded. What was once women's work turned into a man's craft, bolstered by the authority of church and city law. Some women persisted, of course. Records tell of widows maintaining small taverns, of alewives fined for selling beer too weak, of women brewing on the margins where guilds couldn't reach. But their visibility dimmed. What had been normal began to look suspicious. A woman brewing outside official channels risked gossip, accusations, even charges of witchcraft. Imagine an unlucky alewife whose batch turned sour, suddenly whispers claim she cursed it with spells, when the truth was simply bad yeast. Historians still debate how deliberate this exclusion was. Did guilds intentionally push women out? Or was it the unintended result of professionalization? Some argue that women continued brewing in large numbers, just less visibly, their names absent from records written by men. Others see a clear pattern of displacement, with brewing transformed from female household labor into male-dominated commerce. The answer may be both: survival at the edges for many, silence in the records for most, and yet echoes of women's role lingered. Folklore remembered alewives with their broomsticks, their pointed hats, their cauldrons bubbling, images that centuries later fed into the stereotype of witches. A cruel twist of memory, turning practical brewers into figures of fear. You can almost picture a medieval child pointing at an alewife's door and whispering, "Witch," when all she was really doing was selling a mug of warm ale. There's a bittersweet humor here. The same monks who praised fermentation as a miracle sometimes scorned women who did the very same work in their kitchens. The same guilds that demanded secrecy and skill denied women the recognition they deserved. And yet, without those alewives, the tradition might never have existed for monasteries to perfect. You sip in your imagination, and for a moment you taste the hidden labor of countless women, brewing in shadows, passing knowledge quietly, keeping families alive with froth and steam. Their names rarely survive, their recipes lost, their mugs unrecorded. But their work was no less real, no less vital. So tonight, as you walk back into the cloister, you carry that knowledge with you. Behind every barrel in the monastery lies the ghost of an alewife's cauldron, a legacy written not in parchment, but in steam rising from a kitchen fire. The image of women brewing in smoky kitchens fades, and you find yourself back inside the monastery, this time in the scriptorium. The air smells of ink and parchment, candles sputter low, and monks hunch over desks, quills scratching steadily. Here, beer shifts from bubbling vats into books, recipes, observations, and quiet notes captured in margins. Monastic manuscripts weren't recipe books in the modern sense. You won't find neat instructions like boil for 60 minutes or add hops at flameout. Instead, brewing knowledge slipped into records disguised as chronicles, herbals, or household guides. A line about adding grout to cure a cough, a margin note about which grain stored best, a tiny doodle of a brewing paddle beside a psalm. Brewing wove itself into ink as naturally as prayer. Some monasteries compiled herbals that doubled as brewing guides. Lists of plants described their medicinal virtues, but monks knew which doubled as flavoring agents in ale. Imagine a brother carefully illuminating a manuscript page with a delicate drawing of yarrow or sage, never mentioning beer outright, but silently hinting at its use. Brewing knowledge lived between the lines, and sometimes the records were surprisingly practical. A monk might jot, "Beer brewed in winter keeps longer. Beer brewed with new barley ferments poorly," or "Add honey for strength when the grain runs low." These weren't recipes so much as wisdom condensed, observations turned into rules of thumb. You can almost hear the teacher's voice. "Remember, brother, honey for strength, cold for safety." Historians still debate how widespread these brewing notes were. Some argue monasteries kept deliberate, systematic records. Others think they were scattered, incidental, half-hidden in other texts. The truth likely lies in both. Fragments of knowledge preserved here and there, enough to guide the next generation of monks, even if not a full brewing manual. There's a certain humor in imagining a monk copying scripture on one page and then, in the margin scrawling, "Note, last batch soured too quickly, clean the cask better." Holiness and hops, side by side on the same parchment, but books gave brewing longevity. Oral tradition might vanish with a single lost brother. Ink preserved it across centuries. When an old brewmaster died, his quirks and tricks didn't disappear. They lingered in the cramped Latin notes left behind. Younger monks could study, compare, refine. Knowledge became cumulative, and cumulative knowledge became innovation. And don't forget the artistry. Some manuscripts were illuminated with vines, flowers, golden initials. How tempting must it have been to let those decorations mirror the brewhouse, grapes twisting into hops, barley stalks curling into letters. A reminder that brewing, like writing, was both craft and devotion. You sip in your imagination, and it feels like tasting parchment itself, grain and ink, froth and quill strokes, all mingling. Every swallow is backed by centuries of quiet notes, scrawled by candlelight, preserved in books that outlasted the monks themselves. So tonight, as you leave the scriptorium, you realize beer lived not only in barrels but also in books. Brewing wasn't just steam and sweat. It was memory, written carefully on vellum, whispered to the future in lines of ink that carried both psalms and secrets. You close the heavy manuscript in your imagination, the ink still smelling faintly of iron and oak galls, and you hear the distant creak of a monastery gate. Beyond it lies not only a road but an entire world waiting, because monks didn't just keep their beer within cloister walls, they carried it outward, alongside their faith, letting barrels and Bibles travel together. Picture a missionary setting out from the Rhine Valley, robe pulled tight against the wind, pack heavy with books, relics, and perhaps a small cask or two strapped onto a cart. Faith was the mission, but beer was the comfort, the lure, the anchor in strange lands. Wherever monasteries spread, across France, into England, through Flanders, over the Alps, brewing came with them like a shadow. Build a chapel, start a garden, dig a well, set up a brewery. That was the rhythm of expansion. Beer became a tool of settlement. Found a new abbey in wild countryside. Brew beer to nourish the brothers. Welcome nearby villagers with mugs, and suddenly your monastery isn't just a religious outpost, it's a community hub. Faith took root in scripture, but trust often took root in ale. A safe, steady drink won hearts more quickly than sermons alone. And here's a sly irony. Some historians suggest beer did as much to spread Christianity in Northern Europe as preaching did. Imagine a local chieftain, skeptical of new prayers but delighted by a mug that didn't make him sick. "Your God gives good drink," he might mutter, and suddenly the monks had a foothold. Conversions by foam, subtle but effective. Beer also became an export. Surpluses rolled in barrels down rivers, across muddy tracks, into towns hungry for the monastery's reliable brew. Pilgrims carried tales of it along their journeys, spreading the reputation of one abbey's ale hundreds of miles. Over time, certain monasteries became legendary, not only for relics or miracles but for beer. Abbey names became brands long before branding existed. Historians still debate how deliberately monks used beer as a missionary tool. Was it strategy or simply practicality? Some argue it was incidental. Monks brewed for themselves and generosity carried it outward. Others see a more conscious effort, using beer as hospitality, as persuasion, as soft power. Either way, the effect was undeniable. Beer and faith expanded hand in hand. And imagine the cultural blending. A missionary in Ireland encountering local brewing traditions, swapping techniques. A monk in Bohemia adapting recipes to new grains. Brewing wasn't static. It evolved as monasteries carried it across borders, absorbing local flavors and reshaping them. Every new abbey was both a house of prayer and a laboratory of taste. There's even humor in picturing monks explaining their practices abroad. "Yes, we chant the Psalms, we copy holy books, we rise at midnight for prayer. Oh, and we make beer that doesn't taste like swamp water." No wonder doors opened. You sip in your imagination now, a mug brewed in a monastery far from its mother house. The flavor carries echoes of the original recipe, but also new notes, shaped by local water, soil, herbs. Faith and beer, both translated, both adapted, both surviving. And as the night deepens, you realize that monastic brewing was never just local. It was migratory, expansive, woven into the very spread of Christianity across Europe. The gospel flowed in ink, the beer in barrels, and together they shaped a continent. The road of expansion fades, and now the air grows tense, charged with the sound of hammer blows on church doors and fiery sermons echoing across Europe. The Reformation has arrived, and with it tremors that rattle not only altars and relics, but also barrels and brewing vats. What had seemed eternal, the monastery as a place of prayer, charity, and beer, suddenly looked fragile. Picture it, reformers denouncing the wealth of abbeys, accusing monks of indulgence, corruption, and hypocrisy. Brewing, once framed as humble labor, was recast by critics as evidence of excess. "Look," they cried, "holy men drowning in ale while the poor starve." Whether or not the charges were fair, the perception spread faster than yeast in a summer vat. In some regions, monasteries were dissolved outright. Their lands seized, their books burned, their brewing equipment sold off or smashed. One day a brother stirred a kettle in silence. The next, soldiers hauled the copper away. You can almost hear the hiss as centuries of brewing tradition evaporated overnight. And yet, not everywhere. In Catholic regions, monasteries held firm and brewing continued, sometimes even more proudly than before. Beer became not just sustenance but symbol, an emblem of tradition in the face of reform. In Protestant lands, meanwhile, brewing often shifted into private hands, guilds, or emerging commercial breweries. The cloister lost its monopoly. The center of gravity shifted. Historians still debate just how devastating the Reformation was to monastic brewing. Some argue it wiped out centuries of knowledge, scattering traditions like spilled grain. Others note that brewing survived remarkably well, simply relocating from abbey to town. The truth lies in the tension. Monasteries declined, but the beer they had nurtured refused to vanish. It adapted, reshaped, survived. There's even a bitter humor in the contradictions. Reformers condemned monasteries for indulgence, yet towns and princes eagerly inherited their breweries. The same critics who decried monastic mugs raised their own soon enough, enjoying profits without the psalms. Beer remained too useful, too loved to discard. Faith fractured, but thirst remained constant. Imagine the confusion of a monk who had spent decades perfecting recipes, now cast out, watching lay brewers take over his work. Perhaps he muttered, "So much for humility," as barrels rolled into private hands. Or perhaps quietly, he took a job in one of those new breweries. Cloistered devotion transformed into secular employment. For the poor and the pilgrims, the shift must have felt jarring. No longer could they knock at abbey gates for a free cup. Charity thinned as brewing became business. The mug that once carried mercy now came with a price. Communities lost not only beer, but the sense of security monasteries had provided. And yet, through the upheaval, the taste endured. People still brewed, still drank, still carried mugs to lips in feast and fast, joy and sorrow. The vessels changed hands, the recipes adapted, but the froth remained familiar. Even in revolution, beer was too embedded in daily life to disappear. You sip in your imagination now and the flavor feels unsettled. A hint of bitterness like politics seeping into the mash, but also resilience. The undeniable strength of a tradition that refused to die, even when cloisters crumbled, and as the echoes of reform fade, you realize the story of monastic brewing is no longer one of quiet stone halls alone. It is one of survival, reinvention, and the stubborn endurance of liquid bread, even when faith itself fractured around it. The echoes of reform fade, and now you stand in the bustle of a growing town. The cloister gates are quieter than before, their brewing kettles silenced or diminished. But on the cobbled streets something new hums: commerce. Brewing, once the domain of monks and alewives, now strides boldly into the world of private enterprise. The cloister's sacred labor has become an industry. Picture a row of half-timbered houses, each with a painted sign swinging overhead. A tankard, a sheaf of barley, a frothy cask. Inside, lay brewers stir kettles just as monks once did, but their chants are replaced with the clang of hammers and the chatter of apprentices. These are not men bound by vows of humility. They are entrepreneurs eager to sell, to scale, to profit. And their breweries, louder, faster, more ambitious than anything tucked inside monastic walls. Beer becomes less about charity and ritual, more about commerce and competition. Merchants calculate barrels against profit margins. Landlords demand rent in both coin and ale, and brewers court customers with stronger, tastier recipes. Imagine flyers nailed to posts. Try the new hopped ale, fresher, longer lasting. Marketing before marketing existed. This transformation isn't smooth. For some, the shift feels like betrayal. Pilgrims who once received free mugs at abbey gates now find themselves paying in crowded taverns. Villagers mutter that the soul has gone out of brewing, but others welcome it. A pint in the tavern means laughter, music, freedom from solemn silence. Beer escapes the cloister and enters the heart of social life. Historians still debate whether this commercialization improved quality or diluted it. On one hand, competition drove brewers to refine recipes, adopt hops more widely, and invest in better equipment. On the other, profit sometimes encouraged the same old shortcuts. Thin beer stretched too far, spoiled batches disguised with spices. The truth, as always, foams somewhere in the middle. There's humor in the way monks might have watched this unfold. Imagine an old brother shaking his head at a bustling tavern. Too much noise, too much laughter, no reverence at all. Meanwhile, the townsfolk inside raised their mugs, unconcerned, toasting to health and fortune. Sacred solemnity had given way to secular joy, and no one was going back. But don't picture monastic brewing vanishing completely. Some abbeys survived the Reformation and continued brewing on a smaller scale, maintaining their traditions even as the industry roared outside. Their beers became rarities, treasured for their history as much as their taste. Lay brewers, meanwhile, carried forward the techniques and flavors monks had perfected, often without admitting just how much they owed to cloistered pioneers. You sip in your imagination now, a pint drawn not from a monastery cellar but from a town tavern. The taste is brighter, more polished, perhaps more daring. Around you voices rise, dice clatter on tables, fiddles play. Beer is no longer a quiet act of devotion. It's a public performance, a business transaction, a centerpiece of community life. And as you set down the mug, you realize you've stepped fully into a new chapter. Brewing has left the cloisters. The froth belongs now to the marketplace, the tavern, the guild hall. Monks lit the torch, but commerce carries it forward into an age where beer will no longer whisper. It will shout. The tavern noise fades, but if you listen closely, you can still hear a quieter echo, centuries old yet alive today. Because even though brewing marched boldly into commerce, the fingerprints of the monastery never vanished. Modern brewing still carries the DNA of those cloistered experiments, the whispered prayers over bubbling vats, the disciplined notes scribbled in margins. Take a sip of a Belgian Trappist ale, and you're tasting living history. To this day, certain monasteries brew beer not for profit, but for sustenance and charity, their bottles stamped with the seal of authenticity. These beers are world-renowned, sought after by connoisseurs, praised for depth and complexity. Every sip carries a whisper of ora et labora, pray and work. It's the medieval cloister, bottled for the 21st century. Even outside monasteries, echoes linger. The very idea of brewing schedules, sanitation, and consistency, those were born in monastic discipline. Hops, once debated, now define global beer styles. Strong beers for celebration and weaker ones for daily use. That pattern still shapes the shelves of your local store. Stouts for indulgence, lagers for every day. The calendar of brewing, first measured by bells and feast days, still ticks faintly in seasonal releases today. And the marketing, that too owes something to monastic legacy. Many modern breweries borrow monastic imagery, abbot-shaped logos, Gothic fonts, names like Abbey Ale or Monk's Reserve. It's nostalgia, yes, but also recognition. The monastery gave beer its reputation for trust, quality, and even holiness. Centuries later, that branding still sells. Historians still debate just how direct the lineage is. Did commercial brewers truly inherit techniques from monks, or did they reinvent much of it themselves? Some argue the connection is romanticized, polished up for marketing. Others insist the continuity is real, an unbroken chain of yeast and grain stretching back through cloisters. Either way, the romance itself has power. We still believe in the monk with his paddle, stirring devotion into every barrel, and there's humor in that belief. Imagine a monk from the 12th century stepping into a modern bar, staring wide-eyed at neon signs screaming craft IPA and Belgian triple. He takes a sip and mutters, "Not bad, but you added mango?" The echoes of tradition keep colliding with modern taste, and somehow both survive. Even the scientific side of brewing owes thanks to the monastic legacy. Their insistence on cleanliness, repetition, and observation laid the groundwork for later discoveries. Louis Pasteur may have explained yeast, but monks had already respected the unseen miracle for centuries. Their mysticism turned into our microbiology, but the core ore remained. You sip in your imagination a glass of golden beer in a modern pub. The carbonation tickles, the flavor sings with hops and malt, and behind it, if you listen carefully, you hear the faint chant of monks, the clink of wooden mugs, the hiss of fermenting vats in cold stone cellars. Every modern pint is layered, present innovation foaming over ancient echoes. So as the glass empties, you realize this: brewing never truly left the cloister. It lingers in every recipe, every barrel, every sip that promises safety, joy, and a little mystery. The monastery lives on in foam, and history bubbles quietly in your glass. The echo of chants fades into the rustle of stories, because where beer flowed, legends weren't far behind. Monastic brewing, wrapped in mystery and devotion, spawned its own myths, tales of saints, miracles, and magical vats that seemed too wondrous or too ridiculous not to be told. One story tells of Saint Arnold of Soissons, patron saint of brewers, who urged villagers to drink beer during an outbreak of plague. "Don't drink the water," he insisted. "Drink beer, it is safer." And miraculously, those who listened survived. Was it divine intervention, or just the boiling and fermentation killing off disease? The people believed the former, and Arnold was hailed as a holy protector. Imagine him holding a frothy mug in stained glass windows, a saint with barley in one hand and beer in the other. Holiness never looked so foamy. Other tales swirl with equal charm. Some say monks prayed over a spoiled batch and it turned sweet again. Others claimed angels hovered above the vats, blessing the yeast. There were even whispers that certain brews had healing powers beyond medicine, curing fevers, lifting sorrow, restoring strength to the dying. Beer became not just sustenance but sacrament, shimmering with mythical weight. And of course humor crept in. Medieval jesters quipped that monks fasted with mugs larger than their heads, or that abbots secretly kept the strongest ale for themselves. Villagers told tales of novice monks stumbling back to their cells after tasting too many test batches. Some legends painted monks as saints of sobriety, others as sly drinkers who knew how to bend the rules. Historians still debate how much of this was true devotion versus folklore layered onto memory. Did Arnold really save a town with beer? Did angels hover over vats, or were monks just grateful their yeast behaved for once? The line between history and legend foamed over long ago, but the stories themselves mattered. They turned brewing from mere labor into myth, and myths spread. Pilgrims carried them like souvenirs, telling of miraculous mugs at far-off abbeys. Some monasteries leaned into it, their reputations burnished not just by taste, but by tales. "Drink here," a traveler might whisper, "and you'll be blessed." Marketing wrapped in miracle, an unbeatable combination. You sip in your imagination and it feels like tasting a story itself. Maybe the beer is stronger than usual, and you half joke, "Surely a saint blessed this batch." Maybe it's weaker, and you mutter, "The devil spoiled it." Either way, you're participating in the same playful myth-making that medieval drinkers spun centuries ago. There's comfort in it. In a world of uncertainty, plagues, famines, wars, beer became a canvas for hope. If a saint's blessing could hide in a mug, then maybe safety wasn't so far away. If a miracle could froth over a barrel, then perhaps survival was guaranteed. And so the stories endured, bubbling through time, spilling into legend. Saints with mugs, angels over vats, monks laughing into their sleeves. History brewed into myth, myth poured into memory. The last echoes of legends drift away, and the cloister grows still in your imagination. Candles gutter low, the brewery kettles stand silent, the casks rest untouched in the chill of the cellar. You feel the story winding down, not with the clang of mugs or the hum of markets, but with a quiet exhale, as though the monastery itself sighs in its sleep. You've walked through stone halls filled with froth and steam, watched monks stir mystery into vats, listened to pilgrims laugh over mugs, heard guilds argue over secrets, even followed beer as it left the cloister for the noisy world beyond. And now, like the foam settling in a long-finished cup, the tale softens, easing back into stillness. The truth is, beer was never just beer. It was safety when water betrayed. It was food when tables were bare. It was prayer disguised as labor, currency disguised as froth, charity disguised as comfort. It flowed through feast and fast, through cellars and scandals, through books and myths. And though centuries have passed, a little of that monastic hum still lingers in every sip poured today. You imagine yourself holding one last mug, the candlelight catching the surface. The taste is layered, grain and oak, mystery and memory, laughter and silence. Each swallow carries centuries, yet it drifts lightly like a lullaby in liquid form. And as the story slows, the monastery fades into mist. The chants soften until they're barely whispers. The torches dim until they're only embers. You feel the night pressing gently around you, not heavy, not harsh, but soft, like a woolen blanket drawn up to the chin. The images blur. Monks with paddles, pilgrims with jugs, saints with foamy blessings slipping further and further into haze. The words stretch longer now, slower, like a stream meandering toward sleep. You let go of the sharper edges of history. Let the details dissolve, until all that remains is a gentle rhythm. The rise and fall of voices, the steady bubbling of a long-quieted vat, the faint sweetness of barley carried on the air. It's all softer now. The cloister, the brewery, the roads, the towns, they blur together until they feel less like places and more like dreams. You are no longer walking through stone halls or tapping casks in cellars. You're floating, carried gently, as if the very story has become a cradle, rocking you slowly, steadily, deeper into calm. And as the last candle flickers out, the whisper comes not from monks or pilgrims, but from the story itself. Rest now. Let go, drift.